Um, I don't, I don't know about you. I'm at the age where I was a teenager in the 70s, in the mid-70s, graduated from high school in 1976. And as I've been thinking about this whole subject of depression, I don't really remember hearing much about that subject or even the word in my growing up years. Maybe it's just because I wasn't tuned into it. I'm sure people suffered depression. In fact, I know they did. One of the kids I graduated from high school with, when I was a freshman in college, I got word that he had committed suicide. So he was obviously depressed about something. But you just didn't hear that much about it. And one article I came across kind of reinforces that. It says this, it said during the 1950s and 1960s, anxiety was the emblematic mental health problem in the United States, and depression was considered to be a rare condition. But that article went on to say, one of the most puzzling phenomena regarding mental health treatment, research, and policy is why depression has become the central component of the stress tradition since then. So why is it, the article wanted to know, why is it that there is mushroomed this problem of depression in our day? And then I came across some statistics that, again, reinforce that very assertion. From studies in 2017, so that was 7 years ago, said 17.3 million adults, that is 7%, have had at least one major depressive episode. So 7%. It said women are nearly twice as likely as men to have depression. It's probably because women have to deal with men, right? And all God's ladies said, no, not at all. Well, regarding statistics by age, adolescents aged 12 to 17 years old had the highest rate of major depressive episodes, followed by young adults, 18 to 25%. Severe depression among college students, severe depression, and hang on to that term because of our categories we'll talk about later. Severe depression among college students rose from 9.4% to 21.1% from 2013 to 2018. So in that 5-year period, depression among college students more than doubled. And the rate of moderate to severe depression among college students, that is moderate to severe, rose from 23% to 41% from 2007 to 2018. So again, almost double that rate of depression. Now what's interesting about that last statistic, the depression in college-age students in the 2007 to 2018 range, that corresponds perfectly with a book that Chris just finished and I'm kind of listening to on audiobook entitled The Anxious Generation. Maybe you've heard of it. But the author of that book is looking at the connection between the advent of the iPhone and the smartphone and the proliferation of the use of that and the increase in anxiety and depression among young people and that particular age group. And that, he cites those same sort of statistics that the addiction to those little devices has created all kinds of mental health issues. And then this week I subscribe to Epoch Times. I don't know how many of you ever see that newspaper, but in this week's issue of Epoch Times, just to show how widespread, perhaps, depression is, there was a full-page article. It's not so much an article as it is a guide on the newspaper, 6 exercises to combat depression. Now, if only 5% of the population of the United States dealt with depression, this would not make a full-page article in the Epoch Times. But there are these several different exercises that people can do to combat depression. But here's the thing. When we talk about depression, what exactly are we talking about? Because the term is used so broadly, and it encompasses so much, so many different things, that it's really important for us to answer that question. Now, before we get into it, though, we need to clarify something. The focus of this study for the next 6 weeks is not going to be on depression that is caused by some physical disease or malfunction. We're not going to focus on depression connected to a physical malady. A book I just picked up recently and have started is it's called Good Energy, right? Is that the name of it? Good Energy. And it's written by a medical doctor, a woman who practiced in the traditional medical field, very well qualified, but has since left that to focus on functional medicine. And she points out that there is a certain percentage of people who suffer from depression because of physical problems, and she's centering on things like nutrition and sleep and other factors like that. Well, that's not what we're going to talk about, simply because to address that problem requires medical or some kind of medical intervention, some kind of medical involvement. So a person who's suffering from depression, a good first starting point would be to analyze physical situations. What is their diet like? They just sit around all day. They have a sedentary lifestyle, things like that. And also to do a complete blood panel and look at those kinds of things, a physical exam and so forth. So we're not talking about that. We're also not going to talk about depression that is connected to drug use, legal or illegal, because again, a lot of medications can have the side effect of causing depression. Do you chuckle or maybe get aggravated sometimes when you see the multiplicity of commercials for drugs on television? I don't watch regular television much anymore at all, but we used to have cable and we'll watch Fox News and so forth. And do any of you watch Fox News on TV? You see it? Is it still like every other commercial is a drug commercial? Yeah. Well, what's fascinating to me when you watch this drug is the first 10 seconds of the commercial is saying this drug is the answer to this terrible problem that you have, and then the rest of the commercial is talking about all the potential side effects. And in a lot of those, the side effects can be depression. And so drugs can cause depression.
And end with suicidal tendencies and actions.
Right.
Suicidal tendencies
Right.
and actions.
Right.
Side effects.
Yeah.
I don't think I'll take that one.
Yeah. So my little finger may hurt, but at least I'm not going to go kill myself over it. Well, anyway. So the point is, and Wayne Mack brings this out in his book, he says, we are not directly addressing any kind of depression that is physically or biologically induced. Okay? And again, because that also involves addressing physical, biological problems, which is beyond the scope of what we want to deal with. So when we're talking about depression, we're using that term as sort of a catch-all term. There is a clinical, technical definition of depression that we're not going to get into right now. But that's not how depression is used in the vernacular. I mean, in our everyday conversations. When we say, I'm depressed, we don't necessarily, when we say I am depressed, 9 times out of 10, we're not talking about clinical depression. We're talking about some other form. So we use the term as sort of a catch-all way to describe a host of emotional experiences, such as sadness, sorrow, heavy-heartedness, disappointment, discouragement, humiliation, dejection, gloom, disillusionment, demoralization, despondency, despair, a case of the blues. Some of you old-timers might remember the Carpenters song, Rainy Days and Mondays. Remember that one? Goes like this: talking to myself and feeling old. Well, there's a good symptom of being depressed. Talking to myself and feeling old. Sometimes I'd like to quit. Nothing ever seems to fit. Hanging around. Nothing to do but frown. Rainy days and Mondays always get me down. But then the next verse says this: what I've got, they used to call the blues. They used to call the blues. Nothing is really wrong. Feeling like I don't belong. Walking around some kind of lonely clown. Rainy days and Mondays always get me down. So that song is actually putting in its lyrics, or describing in its lyrics, the very broad subject of depression. So when we're going to talk about 3 categories of depression. Wayne Mack brings this out in his book, and by the way, there are a couple of copies of this available on the bookshelf if you want to purchase one of these and get the full content of what we're going to skim through. But he talks about 3 categories of depression: mild depression, and moderate depression, and then severe depression. So for the rest of our time today, we're going to talk about the first 2 categories, and then next Sunday we'll look at the 3rd category of severe depression. So first of all, mild depression. Mild depression is what Mack calls an inevitable response. It's an inevitable response. It's the response that you are going to have, the emotional response you are going to have because of some circumstances of life. The symptoms of mild depression would be a case of the blues, just kind of feeling down. Discouragement, something happens in your life and you're just really discouraged about it. Sadness, disappointment. Mild depression can be simply being not as content or as happy as you usually are. You just have this sense that something is amiss. Can't really put your finger on it necessarily, but it's just something's amiss. I think of mild depression, I think of what Alistair Begg goes through, what he says he goes through every Sunday night. He says after a full day of ministry, preaching, he has a couple of services in the morning and then an evening service. He says he goes home on Sunday night and plops down in his chair and says to his wife, I'm going to see if I can find a proper job tomorrow. You know. And yeah, I mean, he is after a day of ministry emotionally spent, and a lot of pastors feel that same way, and I can relate to that. And you know, I think a lot of pastors make a mistake of taking Monday as their day off. I don't know if it was Wayne Mack or another pastor I read about. He said, I used to do that, and my wife told me I needed to stop taking Monday off because it's the day that we had together, and I was always a grouch. I was always bummed because it is being emotionally depleted from the day before. That's mild depression. There's a certain normalcy about that. Again, Mack puts it this way. He says it's a very common experience, this mild depression, a very common experience that comes and goes with the ups and downs of life. He suggests that even Jesus experienced this. So Isaiah 53 verse 3 says he's a man of sorrows, Jesus, a man of sorrows and acquainted with griefs. So let's look at some of Jesus' experiences. Turn to Matthew chapter 14. So you know, we think of depression as a bad word. We think of depression. We can think of it as sin. It can have a terribly negative connotation. We can feel embarrassed by telling somebody else I'm depressed. But in this, again, this catch-all use of the term, mild depression is a very normal thing. It's a very much a part of life. So in Matthew 14, look at verses 12 and 13. This is in the context of John the Baptist having been arrested by Herod, put in prison, and then beheaded. So verse 11 says, his head was brought on the platter, given to the girl. She brought it to her mother. Then verse 12, then his disciples came and took away the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. And what did Jesus do? How did Jesus respond to that? He didn't just shrug his shoulders and say, oh, well, you know, that's life. Things happen. No. It says in verse 13, when Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. Well, why would he do that? Yeah, to mourn. Sorrow. We would call this a form of mild depression. Let's look at John chapter 6 as another expression of this. Again, I want you to see that this is not sinful response. This is the normal response of being human to circumstances that are grievous or sad and so forth. While you're turning to John chapter 6, I read an article the other day. I saw a news report. Actually, a pastor friend in a Facebook group posted this article, and I followed the article, and it just threw me into a state of sadness. It was about, maybe you've seen it show. I saw it on Fox News article, but it was a pastor and his family were given a sabbatical in Maine, and they were at this lake enjoying the sabbatical at this cabin. It was their last full day of being there at the lake. And they got up, enjoyed breakfast together. Husband and wife were in the back, sitting on the patio, enjoying a cup of coffee or something. The kids went around to the front. They were playing. And all of a sudden they heard a terrible, gut-wrenching scream. Mom and Dad ran around to the front. And a couple of the kids had been playing badminton. And their 6-year-old daughter was just sitting on the sidelines watching the badminton game. And one of the kids playing the game, hit the birdie with the badminton racket. The racket broke, and it sent a spear of the racket, and it pierced the skull of the 6-year-old girl, and she ended up dying from this. And I read this, and I thought, oh my word. And I think the next day, her dad, who was a pastor, assistant pastor at this church, he had a blog. And he was posting every day. I mean, the girl went to the hospital. They tried to save her life, but she was, they call brain dead. And June 4th was the day that the parents had to make the decision to pull the plug. and they talked about the gut-wrenching experience of the wife. The husband said, I remember hearing my wife in labor and the cries of labor, and this was worse than those cries. And I'm reading what he wrote about their experience, and it just, that's absolutely normal. And it should not, that kind of a response should not be, there's this mistaken notion that says, when a Christian loved one dies, the ones left behind should actually just kind of be rejoicing because that person's in heaven now. And you just, no, that's not human. That's not human. It is human to grieve over such things. Yeah. Well, in John chapter 6, there's a completely different kind of situation. Jesus has asserted that he is the bread of life. You see this in verse 35. And he says, he who comes to me shall never hunger. He who believes in me shall never thirst. And so he goes on talking about the fact that he, as the bread of life, is absolutely necessary for life. Of course, he's talking about spiritual life. He is suited for everyone who will eat of him. And he must be eaten every day as the bread of life. And as the bread of life who is eaten on a daily basis, he produces growth. But in verse 66, after this discourse on the bread of life, it says, from that time many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. All right, now how would that hit Jesus? Well, let me ask you this. Those of you that have been in church for 3 or 4 decades of your life, if you have gone through the cycle, the church cycle, where there's plenty of people, the church is relatively full, a lot of kids running around, a lot of good activity, and then something happens. Like we had here in 2010, 9, 10, 11, there was this period of time where several men passed away. Men who'd been in the church for a long time. They passed away. And there were several families who left the church, not because of problem, because they got moved away by work or whatever. And we went from being, vibrant to being depressed. Because all of a sudden, this was just after we finished the nursery. We moved the nursery back there because we had so many kids in the nursery. We needed an infant nursery, a toddler nursery. We had all these kids here. And we went from that, 3 months later, to no kids in the nursery at all. And it was depressing. It was depressing. And it was a normal thing. Like Jesus says here that many of the disciples went and walked with him no more. And look at how Jesus responds in verse 67. Jesus said to the 12, will you go also? Do you want to go away also? Why would he ask that question? Would that not be a normal question for a human being to respond with when you see all these people leaving? Oh, are you going to go too? Are you going to go too? See? It's an expression of disappointment, for sure. Then John 11. John chapter 11. In John 11, of course, the account of the death of Lazarus. And in verses 32 and 33, because you remember all the discourse there between Mary and Martha and so forth. Verse 32 says, when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, obviously, Mary and Martha are going through a time of depression, mild depression, caused by grief, the death of Lazarus. But then verse 33 says, therefore when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. There was, if you will, a mild depression response on the part of Jesus, prompted by this experience that he is dealing with right now, which is seeing Mary weeping and all the Jews who came with her weeping. It caused him to groan in his spirit and to be troubled. And in verse 34 and 35, it goes on to say, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. And then verse 35, Jesus wept. Jesus wept. So in verses 32 and 33, verse 32 and 33, Jesus is grieving over unbelief. Over unbelief. How so? Well, because he's been trying to tell them, do you not know I am the resurrection and the life? Your brother will live. Yeah, I know he will live, but they're not, it's like they're not believing that. They're not believing that. And then in verses 34 and 35, he's grieving over the effects of sin. What is the effect of sin? What's the ultimate effect of sin? Death. Yeah, death. So he's grieving over that. By the way, I want to point out a distinction between weeping and weeping. Okay? In verse 33, where it says Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews weeping, the Greek word is kleio. Kleio. I'm not going to test you on that. But I want you to see there's a different word in verse 35. In verse 35, the word is dakruo. Kleio and dakruo. What's the difference between the two? The word kleio in verse 33 is a weeping that emphasizes noise accompanying that weeping. So, for example, the pastor who lost his 6-year-old daughter, writing in his blog, talks about sitting in another room, himself grieving, but hearing the cries of his wife as they contemplate having to pull the plug on their daughter. Okay, that's kleio. That's kleio. Dakruo is a word that simply means to shed tears. So it would be like sitting by yourself, grieving over something, and just head down and like that. It's very, very private, very personal, very quiet. It's the difference between the two. But in either case, Jesus is grieving over unbelief in verse 33, and he's grieving over the effects of sin in verses 34 and 35. Now here's the thing. Jesus was in all points tempted like as we are, right? So he was even tempted in the area of emotionally responding to grievous, discouraging, etc. circumstances that cause mild depression. He was tempted in how he would handle mild depression, yet without sin. Yet without sin. Jesus said, I always do those things that are pleasing to the Father. So Jesus experienced mild depression without sin. And then I think of the experiences of the Apostle Paul. How would it have impacted him emotionally, for example, when in the first missionary journey, they're not all that long into it, Paul and Barnabas had taken Mark along with them, remember that? And Mark left. Mark left. It impacted Paul to such an extent that later on, when Barnabas wanted to take Mark with them on the next missionary journey, Paul said no. No, not going to happen. How did that departure affect Paul emotionally? And is it comparable, the emotional response, is it comparable to that which he expresses in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 10, where he says to Timothy, Paul is going to die in not too many days. And he says to Timothy, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. That term, forsaken me, is an emotionally charged term. Okay? And then 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians 11. Look at this litany of experiences of Paul. Verses 25 and following. He says, 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times shipwrecked, night and day I've been in the deep, journeys often, perils of water, perils of robbers, countrymen, Gentiles, in the city, in the wilderness, in the sea, among false brethren, in weariness and toil, sleeplessness often, hunger and thirst, fastings often, cold and nakedness. And then he says this, besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak, Paul says. Now, so all of these things would have contributed to Paul experiencing the normalcy of mild depression. So what is some biblical insight we can have for that regarding mild depression? Well, Ecclesiastes 3 verse 4. There is a time to weep and there's a time to laugh. There's a time to weep, a time to laugh. Like I said earlier, it is a mistake to give the sense to fellow Christians that it would be wrong to be sorrowful over the death of a loved one. Well, there's a time for sorrow. And 1 Peter 1:6, Peter writes, in this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials. So what the scripture indicates is that it is normal to deal with this mild depression. Even what Paul writes regarding the loved ones who have died, who know the Lord, in 1 Thessalonians 4:13, he says, we sorrow, but not as those who have no hope. Okay, we do sorrow, not as those who have no hope. So here's the conclusion, Mac's conclusion to this. He says, the scripture reveals that as long as we do not lose hope, there's nothing wrong with feeling the emotional down of sad and difficult events in our lives. All right, that's mild depression. Moderate depression takes mild depression into the realm of sin. Moderate depression could be considered the wrong response. The wrong response. There are 2 ways to respond to mild depression. One is, the right response is the acknowledging of the sad circumstances, but not submitting to the feelings. Acknowledging the sad circumstances, but not submitting to the feelings. In other words, allowing those feelings to control us, to control our thinking, our attitudes, our behavior. So, a couple of passages of Scripture. Colossians 3, verse 2, challenges us to set our mind on things above and not on earthly things. Philippians 4:8, whatsoever things are true, just, noble, pure, lovely, good report, virtuous, praiseworthy. Think on these things. So I'm going through something that isn't in any of those categories. It's not particularly in those categories. So how do I respond to this thing? Sadness? Yes. Mild depression? Yes. But then setting my mind, thinking on these other things as well. The wrong response to mild depression would be to acknowledge the sad situation and then submit to the feelings. Let me share with you Mac's explanation of this distinction. He says, some people pay far too much attention to their feelings, choosing to focus on them rather than on God. While focusing on God reduces the intensity of painful emotions, focusing on emotions has the opposite effect. Feelings of depression are magnified by the attention they receive and begin to control thoughts and actions. People who do this are ruled by their spirits, neglect biblical responsibilities, lose hope, and find that they get less and less satisfaction from spiritual things. This is the effect of moderate depression. As their focus remains on their circumstances and the feelings generated by those circumstances. This is the focus of my attention, focus of my life now. These people often find that they begin to cry easily, become easily annoyed, experience longer periods of sadness, and have difficulty performing the normal activities of their life. Their minds are set on the negative aspects of their life, earthly things, rather than on God's promises, purposes, and power things above. What started as mild depression becomes moderate depression. So let's go back to this family that lost the 6-year-old. I mean, all of the communication of the grief that they experienced, absolutely normal. But this gives you an illustration of how, as a family, they did not allow the terribly sad circumstances to cause them to lose all hope and and wallow in utter despair. So this accident and everything happened in Maine. They were from New Jersey. So they spent, of course, days and days in Portland, Maine, in the hospital there, until finally their daughter died. And then they had to go home. And they had friends that came to be supportive of them and followed them home, trailed them home. And the dad writes that when they got home, they pulled in the driveway, and first they had a hard time even getting out of the car. Did not want to go in the house. They finally got out of the car, they went up to the house, and they all just sat on the front porch of the house. They just sat there for a while, and they cried, and they mourned. And finally, one of the kids, I think he said, asked the question, what would the good girl, I can't remember, Lucy, I think was her name, what would Lucy want us to do? What would Lucy want us to do? And that was a turning point where they started talking about the Lord and how Lucy had just a few weeks earlier come to faith in Christ, and they started rejoicing. They began to be able to laugh. They talked about the way she would say certain words, and then they recounted how Lucy came to Mom just a few weeks earlier and said, how can I be something like, how can I be accepted by God, to God, and how can I go to heaven, and so forth. And Mom explained to her the gospel. And Lucy, after hearing that, she just ran to her room and asked the Lord to save her. And they just rejoiced in that. So there's the difference. They did not allow the very understandable, reasonable, mild depression lead to moderate depression and the wrong response. So some biblical examples, I'll just throw these out to you. Asaph, remember this in Psalm 73, where Asaph experiences the grief-inducing circumstance of looking around and seeing all the wealthy people who are proud and arrogant and nothing bad ever happens to them. And then he responds by saying, I've cleansed my hands in vain. This was all worthless, and so forth. And he ends up becoming bitter. Jeremiah, Lamentations chapter 3 is another example of one who experiencing mild depression circumstances that led into temporary moderate depression. And the same in Psalm 42 and 43. With this we'll close. Look at these two psalms. They are generally considered to be sung together because of the repeated refrain. In verse 5, why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? That repeats 3 times in these 2 psalms. So the psalmist is acknowledging that he is in a state of depression of some form. And the symptoms of this, in verse 3, he says, my tears have been my food day and night, while they continually say to me, where is your God? And verse 6, the soul is cast down, verse 9, and so forth. Verse 9, he says, I will say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? So he succumbs to this moderate depression, responding in the wrong way to circumstances of mild depression. He doesn't stay there, though. He doesn't stay there. He doesn't allow the moderate depression to lead to severe depression because of why? Verse 5. He tells himself, hope in God. Hope in God. I shall yet praise him for the help of his countenance. All right, so there's this distinction between mild depression and moderate depression. Next week we'll look at the third category of severe depression, which is, of course, far more serious to deal with. Okay? All right. We have 2 minutes. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
I haven't done it in a very long time, but a couple of times I've had to debrief law enforcement officers or emergency service personnel, firemen, and when they've gone through a loss of a comrade or in the line of duty and so forth. And what we were taught was in the counseling, debriefing, is that don't cover up. Mourning is a process.